Welcome to Functional Philosophy, the show in which I, Charles II, explain and apply Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism. If you'd like to ask me a question on objectivism or its application, just go to charles2.com/contact. And my last name is spelled T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. April Fools, there was no podcast on Monday, which was April Fool's Day. But no, I'm just kidding. That had nothing to do with April Fool's Day. And there is a podcast now, and there will be another one on Monday, which I can guarantee because I'm recording 2 in a row right now. So, first question today. How much attention should one pay to Rand's opinions/thoughts on music? I predominantly listen to hip-hop and wasn't very happy to find that Rand considers me a psycho-epistemological savage, since that is what she called people that enjoy drum-heavy music in the Romantic Manifesto. Well, how much attention should you pay to Rand's thoughts on music? The answer to that is obvious: as much attention as you think is warranted by the plausibility of Ayn Rand's thoughts on music, or by her insights in other areas, which would mean that maybe she has some insight to offer here too. So obviously what you are asking for is permission from me to evade a possible fact that puts you in a negative light. And I don't grant you that permission. There is such a thing as good and bad taste in music, in food, in humor, many different areas. Your emotions are not the standard. You can't just say, well, I like this music and therefore it's good. For the same reason you can't say, well, I like murdering people. That's what gives me joy. Well, murdering people is against your self-interest. So you should strive to be the kind of person who gets joy from life-affirming activities. So there is a reality-based standard. It's not your emotions. This is why with comedy, for instance, if you say something's not funny, obviously you don't mean that the person didn't find it humorous. You're not making a claim about that person's emotions. You're saying you shouldn't find that funny. You should strive to be the kind of person who doesn't find that joke funny. It's not that you didn't find it funny, it's that it's bad to have found it funny. Now that's incoherent to most people because most people hold subjectivism as their premise. They think, how can you get deeper than my emotions? I found it funny. What more could there be than that? Well, what more there could be is reality. Maybe you shouldn't find that joke funny. And the standard is ultimately your own life. Now, I don't say it's immoral to have bad taste. You could have grown up in a situation where your parents buy you fast food every day and that's all you eat. So all you like is chicken nuggets and you can't enjoy a great steak. That's not necessarily immoral, but what is immoral is claiming that, well, it's all subjective. Great steak isn't superior to chicken nuggets because I don't like the idea that I have an inferior palate. As soon as you claim egalitarianism, then you cross the line into immorality. It's not immoral necessarily to have bad taste, but once you claim that there is no such thing as bad taste as a form of evasion, then you are immoral, which is obviously what this questioner is doing. Now, I think there are 2 different ways of having bad taste. I think you can have underdeveloped taste and also a positive attraction to the bad. So, in music, for instance, maybe you just don't notice the bad things about rap, for instance, and you don't appreciate the good things about higher forms of music. And so it's just an issue of sensitivity. You can't, it's just a lack of appreciation versus being positively attracted to the bad elements of whatever you're listening to. Uh, those are two different ways of having bad taste. Now, I think most people have bad taste in many areas, especially music. I have a degraded musical taste. I think to some extent that's unavoidable in the time we live in, given what we are exposed to culturally. You develop certain taste as a child, and it takes work to improve your taste. So I don't even say it's mandatory to improve your taste because it takes work, it takes time, and you may have other priorities. Yes, you should learn to appreciate better kinds of food if all you eat is McDonald's. Or it would be better, I should say, to be able to appreciate better kinds of food. But it's not necessarily a moral imperative to improve your palate because that takes time and you have to expose yourself to certain kinds of food, and that takes all kinds of planning and just work. So you might be busy and have other things to do. So I don't even say you have to improve, but don't go around pretending that everything is equal and nothing is better or worse than anything else, because that's not true. Now, if your job involves a certain area, then of course it is imperative to have good taste. So, accept that you have bad taste in music, and then possibly try to improve your taste so you like something higher than hip hop, or reject the question altogether because you want your emotions to dictate reality, and then you can live the miserable life that entails. Up to you. Why do you despise the concept of equal opportunity? I understand that the government's attempts to force it onto us often result in destruction and the opposite effect, but if it were to occur in a just and natural manner, wouldn't it be a good thing? Well, the question is, good to whom? There is no God up there who cares about equality per se. Equality is a relational concept. It means two or more people are equal. Multiple different things are equal to each other. Is that good or bad? Well, you can't answer that question before you ask it from a particular perspective. Is it good or bad for me to be equal to you in wealth? Well, good for whom? For me? For you? And then on top of that, you have to ask, what does that imply about what's going to change? Does that mean I'm going to become more wealthy because you're more wealthy than I am, so I'm going up? Or does it mean I'm going to become less wealthy? So there are two issues here. First, you can't ask this question before you know the facts of the situation. Is equality good? You have to know what position you're starting in before you could say that, because that could mean you're going up or down. And second, you have to ask it from the perspective of a particular person, because there's no such thing as good in itself. There's no God up there who cares about equality per se. And even if there were, that would be good for God and not for you or me. This is what's wrong with the Rawlsian veil of ignorance original position idea. That method is invalid. You don't ask a question by stepping outside of existence. You know, this idea is, how should society be? What kind of, should we have equality? Is equality good? And his method is, well, let's think about how we would want society to be if we were asking the question before we were born. So we don't know who we are, what our situation is. How would we want society to be? And he says, well, we'll say we want some kind of equality, so that way we know that we'll be in a pretty good position no matter where we end up. But you never get to ask that question. It's like, that is the same thing as asking, how would you want anything, any fact to be? Would you want 2 plus 2 to equal 4 if you could choose? It doesn't make any sense. You can't do that. It's like asking, is it good for me to have been born in the year I was born? Is it good for me to live now in the 21st century as opposed to the 1800s? You can't ask, is that good or bad? I never had a choice. Nobody ever had a choice. I mean, my parents had a choice, but not about bringing me specifically as a person into the world. I didn't have a choice about coming into the world in the time I came into it. So you can't say that's good or bad. It's just a fact. So there's never a time where you can ask this question. There's never a time before you exist for you to ask this question. And once you already exist, then what's good or bad is determined by your position. So stepping outside of your position and saying, well, what's good or bad before I exist? That doesn't make any sense. That is invalid methodologically, because to determine what's good or bad, you first have to recognize the fact of your own existence and your nature and your context, and that determines what's good or bad. So you can't say, well, before that, what would you want? Nothing, because I don't exist yet. There's no standard yet. So you can't ask whether equality is good per se. It isn't anything per se. You have to ask about equality from a particular perspective, because things are only good or bad to individuals. And even then, you have to have already established a fact of the matter. So even if you say, well, is equality good for you? Well, given what context? I already have to exist in a context for equality to imply anything. Because before I exist in some context, whether I'm equal to you doesn't mean anything, because I don't yet exist. Once I exist, then that has meaning, because then it means, well, you're going up from where you are or down from where you are. So this whole idea of, well, isn't equality good though? You have an intrinsicist view of good. So whether equality is good depends on how it affects me. And for you, it depends on how it affects you. And how it affects you is negatively if it's forced on you or even aimed at as an end in itself, because it isn't an end in itself. What is an end in itself is your life and your well-being. And if that means you wind up equal to somebody else, that's fine. If it means you end up wildly unequal compared to other people, that's fine too. Equality is derivative. It doesn't matter. It's not an end in itself. What is your own well-being, how good you are doing. One of my favorite things to do is art, writing fiction and poetry specifically. And I notice that many contemporary artists of all kinds tend to be extremely progressive politically, clinging to SJW-style identity politics, a hatred of capitalism, and moral relativism. There should have been an Oxford comma there, because the way you wrote that makes it sound like they hate moral relativism. Anyway, is there any reason that this particular flawed mindset would appeal to an artist specifically? Well, there's nothing inherent about being an artist that means that you lean left. It is true that artists do lean left. You have identified a truth there, but that's not because of anything inherent in being an artist. First, it's important to note that this is not restricted to artists. Everyone leans left to the extent that they are exposed to the intellectual establishment. This goes for creative types of all kinds, not just artists, and anyone who's engaged in anything highly intellectual. Now, the common idea is, well, we have artists and they're these effete, sensitive types, and so they tend to be concerned with the poor and the downtrodden, and they are highly empathic, etc. Versus take the military, where you have these rugged types, so they're more individualistic and right wing. But that is wrong. You find the exact same thing in the military. The military brass, the highest levels of military leadership, are indistinguishable from leftist artists and intellectuals. I was just listening to General Stanley McChrystal on Jordan Peterson's podcast. And he said that, it's who's to say we're right and the Muslims are wrong? He's over there running operations in Afghanistan, and, who's to say we're right and they're wrong? He says, that he thinks of that. This wasn't something he was presenting as, that occurs to me, but I know it's not right. He was just straightforwardly saying, hey, who can say? Maybe we're wrong and they're right. Maybe America and freedom and Western values, maybe all that's wrong. And Islamic totalitarianism is good. Who can say, really? Who can know for sure? So you have this skepticism, this moral relativism, which is one of the major things you just mentioned. And then he's writing this book on leadership, and he's choosing all of these figures from history, and he mentions people like Robespierre. And then he goes to Robert E. Lee, and he says, after Charlottesville, I really had to struggle with that. What? You just mentioned a horrible dictator. Oh, but now we have to hand wring over Robert E. Lee? So you're okay with that? With dictatorship? Oh, but this is, well, of course, this relates to slavery in America, so now this is just some horrible special evil thing. And you'll notice that all of that skepticism and subjectivity, who can say who's right and wrong, evaporates. Oh, well, of course, this is something that has to do with political correctness. I mean, of course, slavery is wrong, at least when practiced in America. If it says something bad about America, well, then obviously, I mean, just no question here. All that hand-wringing, all of that skepticism, all of that just vanishes. We can be absolutely certain about politically correct values, of course. So, I mean, the military leadership, as I said, they're indistinguishable from these politically correct SJW artist types. So this is not an issue of anything inherent to being an artist. It's an issue of being exposed to the dominant ideas of the intellectual establishment. And you can see this with McChrystal. He's not a grunt. He's not an enlisted person. He's writing a book on leadership. He's at the highest level managing operations. And he has to think about these highly sophisticated, abstract, intellectual issues. And because he is engaged in this high-level intellectual work, which is what is involved in being a military leader, he is just as corrupt as the artists, who are similarly intellectual. So, no, there's nothing about being an artist that makes you leftist. There's something about being an intellectual today, when what you learn from intellectuals is Marxism superficially, and then all of the philosophical ideas that undergird that. If you'd like to keep up with everything I do, just go to charles2.com. If you'd like to enable me to do more, just go to patreon.com/charles2 and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.